On the night of October 20th, 1964, Joseph Bonanno sat down for dinner in Midtown Manhattan with 3 of his own lawyers. He was due before a federal grand jury the next morning. He never made it. Within hours, police were telling reporters that the boss of one of New York's 5 mafia families was dead. He was not dead. He was gone. And where he went, and why, would not become clear for 19 months. What happened in between would split his own organization into a war that carried his name into newspaper headlines for the rest of the decade. To understand that night, the story has to start more than 3 decades earlier. In the spring of 1931, New York's Italian-American underworld was coming out of the Castellamarese War, a conflict between 2 rival faction leaders, Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, that had run for over a year and left both men dead by that September. That war marked the end of the old, insular Sicilian leadership style historians call the mustache Petes, and the start of a younger, more business-minded generation running things, men in their 20s and 30s who wanted profit and order more than they wanted old-world tradition. Out of that war came a new structure, a commission, a governing council meant to arbitrate disputes between what would come to be known as New York's 5 families. One of Maranzano's closest allies in that fight was a 26-year-old Sicilian immigrant, Giuseppe Bonanno, known in America as Joseph. When Maranzano was murdered that September, it was Bonanno who inherited control of his organization, becoming one of the youngest bosses in the American Mafia's history and taking a seat at the commission table that would define the rest of his life. Joseph Bonanno was born Giuseppe Carlo Bonanno on January 18, 1905, in Castellammare del Golfo, a fishing town on Sicily's northwest coast, to Salvatore Bonanno and Catherine Bonventre. According to Selwyn Raab's History of the 5 Families, the Bonanno name already carried weight in the criminal underworld of that town before Joseph was born. His father and his uncles led a local clan that would go on to send several of its own sons, and several more from the related Bonventre family, into the American Mafia over the following decades. At age 3, the family emigrated to Brooklyn, where they lived for about a decade before returning to Sicily. Bonanno came back to the United States alone in 1924, at 19, entering the country illegally by stowing away on a fishing boat that landed him near Tampa, Florida, a detail confirmed both in Anthony DeStefano's reporting on the period and in federal immigration records cited in later court proceedings. In his own later account, Bonanno claimed his return was forced by Benito Mussolini's crackdown on the Sicilian Mafia, which had broken up the networks his family depended on and derailed what he described as a hoped-for career at a naval academy. Historians who have examined the period, including Raab, treat that version with real skepticism. What is documented is simpler. Bonanno made his way back to Brooklyn and fell in with a bootlegging crew, run by Nicola Schiro, during Prohibition. When the Castellamarese War broke out in 1930, Bonanno, not yet 26, sided with fellow Sicilian Salvatore Maranzano against the older, established boss, Giuseppe Masseria. He proved capable and loyal enough that when Maranzano was killed the following year, the Castellamarese faction turned to him rather than to older, more senior men. He took control of what would become known as the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 organizations that, in some form, still exist today, and held that position for the next 37 years. That same year, 1931, he married Fay Labruzzo. The marriage lasted until her death in 1980, and produced the 3 children who would inherit both his name and its complications. For more than 2 decades, Bonanno ran his family with a discipline other bosses respected. Raab's 5 Families and Jerry Capecci's decades of reporting on the commission both describe a boss who preferred quiet, legitimate-looking fronts, garment industry companies, and a cheese-importing business among them, over the more visible rackets some of his rivals favored. He also expanded aggressively outside New York, building operations in Arizona, California, and Canada at a time when the commission expected its bosses to stay inside agreed territory, and historians point to that expansion as one of the earliest sources of friction between Bonanno and his fellow bosses. Bonanno himself always insisted his organization stayed out of narcotics, a claim he repeated at length in his own later writing. Federal investigators and historians who have reviewed the case files disagree. Both DeStefano's reporting and federal court records from later prosecutions describe Bonanno-connected operations trafficking heroin through this same period, generally treat his drug-free claim as one of the more self-serving parts of his own account. His expansion beyond New York followed a similar pattern of pushing past what the commission considered acceptable. Other bosses referred to it as Bonanno planting flags in open cities, territory in Arizona, and parts of Canada that the commission had not formally assigned to any single family, and more than one historian has pointed to that expansion as the real source of the resentment that would catch up with him a few years later. One of those Canadian ties surfaced publicly only decades later. In May of 1964, months before his disappearance that October, Bonanno had lunch in Montreal with a young cheese-making family named Saputo, then running a modest operation out of a single building in the city's Saint-Michel neighborhood. That family's business would go on to become one of the largest dairy companies in North America, and according to CBC News reporting on later administrative hearing records, a retired New York judge reviewing the relationship in 1980 concluded the ties between Bonanno and the Saputos were close enough that doing business with the family was not in New York State's public interest, a finding the Saputos spent decades afterward disputing. On November 14, 1957, Bonanno was one of roughly 100 organized crime figures from across the country who gathered at the rural New York estate of Joseph Barbara in the town of Apalachin for what was meant to be a national meeting of mafia leadership. The meeting had been called by Vito Genovese, who was looking to formalize his own takeover of the old Luciano organization in the weeks after the murder of Albert Anastasia, a killing this channel has covered in its own right. State troopers grew suspicious of the unusual traffic on a quiet country road and raided the property. 59 men were arrested on the spot, Bonanno reportedly among dozens more, who fled on foot through the surrounding woods rather than be caught. For the first time, federal law enforcement and the American public had public, documented confirmation that a National Criminal Commission actually existed, a discovery that fed directly into the Senate's McClellan Committee hearings and ushered in a new era of federal pressure on organized crime that Bonanno would spend the rest of his career trying to stay ahead of. 6 years later, Bonanno's own ambitions caught up with him. In 1963, according to both Raab and DeStefano, Bonanno conspired with Joseph Magliocco, the newly installed boss of the Profaci family, to assassinate rival commission members, Carlo Gambino and Thomas Lucchesi, among the intended targets, in what would have been a violent bid to seize control of the commission itself. The plot collapsed when the man assigned to carry it out, a Profaci capo named Joseph Colombo, warned the intended victims instead of killing them. The commission investigated, fined Magliocco, and stripped him of his title. He died of a heart attack that December. Bonanno himself refused to appear before the commission to answer for his role, and by the following autumn, with federal investigators also circling and a grand jury subpoena already in hand, he was a boss running out of places to hide. The grand jury Bonanno was scheduled to face on October 21, 1964, wanted him to answer questions tied to that federal investigation into commission activity. He never sat for it. According to Gay Talese's Honor Thy Father, later corroborated in Raab's History of the Five Families, Bonanno was seized outside the Manhattan restaurant, where he had just finished dinner with his lawyers, forced into a car by armed men, and driven out of the city. Police told reporters the next morning that he was likely dead. He was not. Investigators and historians have generally concluded the abduction was arranged by a Bonanno rival within his own extended family, Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino, though accounts differ on the details, and Bonanno himself, when he eventually spoke about it, offered a murkier version of events. He stayed missing for 19 months, resurfacing in May of 1966, before dropping out of sight again, almost immediately. It would be 16 years before federal prosecutors got a real conviction out of him, and even then, not for anything close to murder or racketeering. In 1980, according to federal court records from the Southern District of New York, Bonanno was convicted of obstruction of justice for interfering with a grand jury investigating his own sons. He served roughly 8 months and was paroled in the summer of 1984. The investigation behind that conviction had targeted his son Salvatore, known as Bill, who by his own later account spent a combined 12 years in and out of federal custody across several separate cases stretching from the late 1960s into the 1990s, a clear sign that whatever protection the Bonanno name still carried by then, it did not extend to keeping the next generation out of prison. 3 years earlier, in 1983, he had published A Man of Honor, his own account of mafia life, co-written with journalist Sergio Lali. According to reporting from that period, Federal prosecutors, including then United States Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, drew on the organizational chart and internal detail in Bonanno's own book while building the 1985 Mafia Commission trial, formerly United States versus Salerno, which went on to convict the sitting bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families. The sitting boss of Bonanno's own former family, Philip Rastelli, was convicted in that same case and sentenced to 12 years. The Gambino family's boss, Paul Castellano, was removed from the case only because he was murdered in December of 1985, before the trial concluded. Bonanno himself was subpoenaed as part of that case and refused to testify about his former colleagues. He was held in contempt of court and served 14 months in prison, from 1985 into 1986, the last time the federal government would ever get him behind bars. The 19 months Bonanno spent missing, between October of 1964 and May of 1966, cost his organization far more than it cost him personally. With their boss gone, and no clear successor, the commission grew impatient and installed a Bonanno capo, Gaspar Di Gregorio, as acting boss in 1965. Bonanno's own loyalists, led in large part by his son Salvatore, refused to recognize Di Gregorio's authority, and the two factions went to war. Newspapers, playing on Bonanno's own nickname, dubbed it the Banana War, and treated it as something close to a joke. The men who died in it did not find it funny. Over the next several years, soldiers on both sides were shot in restaurants, parking lots, and social clubs across Brooklyn and Queens. And Di Gregorio, unable to end the violence or unite the family, was eventually replaced by the commission with another Bonanno capo, Paul Sciacca. Historians differ on an exact body count for the Banana War, but most estimates place the number of men killed in the fighting between 1966 and 1969 somewhere in the dozens, nearly all of them soldiers and capos rather than the bosses who had started the conflict. The organization Bonanno had built over 3 decades came out of that war smaller, poorer, and far less disciplined than it had been. A weakness later Bonanno bosses were never fully able to reverse. That weakness had consequences that outlasted Bonanno's own career by more than a decade. It was the same depleted, disorganized Bonanno family that an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone was able to infiltrate under the alias Donnie Brasco between 1976 and 1981, an operation that led to more than 100 convictions and very nearly finished off what remained of the organization Bonanno had once run. The instability that began with the Banana War resurfaced again in 1979, when former Bonanno underboss Carmine Galante, who had spent much of the 1960s in federal prison before returning to seize power in the family, was shot to death at a Brooklyn restaurant, a killing historians generally attribute to a commission that had grown just as uneasy with Galante's ambitions as it once had with Bonanno's own. By 1968, with the Banana War still simmering and his own health declining, Bonanno formally stepped down and moved to Tucson, Arizona, ending 37 years as boss of one of New York's 5 families. Faye, his wife of nearly 50 years, died there in 1980, the same year Bonanno was convicted on the obstruction charge tied to his sons. He lived out the following 2 decades largely out of the headlines, granting occasional interviews, writing his book, and serving his final prison sentence for contempt in his early 80s. He also gave a rare television interview to CBS's 60 Minutes in 1968, not long after his retirement, and appeared again decades later in a television documentary built around his own life story, one of very few commission-era bosses willing to speak on camera at all. By the time of his death, he had outlived nearly every other man who had sat on the commission in 1931. Joseph Bonanno died of heart failure on May 11, 2002, at a hospital in Tucson. He was 97 years old, a longer life than almost any mafia boss of his generation, nearly all of whom died in prison, in mob violence, or far younger than he did. He was buried at Holy Hope Cemetery in Tucson. His longtime Arizona attorney told reporters afterward that circumstance rather than character had shaped Bonanno's path, suggesting that in different times he might have run a legitimate company rather than a criminal organization. It is a version of Bonanno that his own memoir was clearly built to support. The documented record tells a more complicated story. Historians who study this era treat a man of honor with real caution. Raab and De Stefano both note that Bonanno's account minimizes his own role in some of the era's more violent chapters, casts himself as a man of tradition rather than a career criminal, and gets central facts about events like Apalachin demonstrably wrong. Federal prosecutors, according to reporting at the time, still found the book useful, not as truth, but as a working map of how the commission was actually organized, one they leaned on while building the case that convicted several of Bonanno's fellow bosses 2 years later. What the historical record supports, more than Bonanno's own version of it, is that he was one of the last men alive who had sat at the commission's original table in 1931, and one of very few mafia bosses of his generation to reach old age rather than dying in prison or in mob violence. Compared to later cooperator memoirs from men like Joseph Valachi or Sammy Gravano, Bonanno's book stands out for one reason. He never cooperated with the government a day in his life, and never named another living man to a grand jury. What he did instead was publish, which historians researching the era note was, in its own way, just as damaging to the commission's secrecy as a courtroom confession would have been. Later chroniclers of the 5 families, Raab among them, have said as much directly, that whatever else it got wrong, a man of honor handed both prosecutors and historians a map of the commission's internal structure that no single law enforcement source had produced before it. It is also worth saying plainly, the criminal organization Bonanno led, and the small circle of men who ran organizations like it, represented a narrow criminal minority within the much larger Italian-American community of the 20th century, a community whose story is not the subject of this channel, and whose history was shaped far more by immigration, labor, faith, and family than by the commission Bonanno served. What the record leaves behind is not the man of honor Bonanno wrote himself into being, but something closer to the opposite. A boss whose reach for more power in 1963 nearly got 2 of his rivals killed, and whose 19 months in hiding the following year cost his own family a war it took years to recover from. Consequences it was still absorbing more than a decade later. That is the pattern this channel keeps returning to. Men who built real, often brutal power, and the documented cost of what they built. Next time on the 5 Family Files, we go back to where this story started, inside the Castellamarese War itself, the 14 months of killing that created the 5 families Bonanno spent the rest of his life trying to lead.